Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Hannah Gould, and I'm the Digital Marketing Associate for the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to ICMEC's webinar, Protecting Children Missing from Care, Challenges and Potential Solutions. Today we are going to hear a presentation from ICMEC's Director of Global Missing Children's Issues, Dr. Felicity Sackville-Northcott. Dr. Northcott is a subject matter expert on international child welfare and missing children's issues. She's trained hundreds of professionals on their roles in cross-border child protection cases, best practices in international family finding and engagement, and managing complex international child welfare cases. Dr. Northcott is also joined by Alaura Ervin, legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Cornyn and education, labor, and human services policy expert, to discuss the urgent issue of children missing from care and the legislation her office is working on to better protect missing foster children. So you're aware this webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel, both following this presentation. Also, there will be a short Q&A session following both speakers' presentations. So please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A during the presentation or after, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. Now I'll go ahead and hand it over to the presentation.
Thanks, Hannah, and good morning, everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here this morning, particularly those of you who are World Cup fans and are missing primetime World Cup action. I apologize in advance for that. This is a really important issue. I think it's an overlooked issue, and it's something that I hope moving forward that both ICMEC and others around the world will be willing to really put some time and effort behind understanding the scope of the problem. So this is really going to focus on the U.S. picture, and while I'm fully aware that the problem of children missing from foster and institutional care is a worldwide problem, I want to focus today on the U.S. because I think it's a really good illustration of the scope of the problem, what are the barriers to rectifying the problem, and how to look at some potential solutions, including what Laura will be talking about after I finish, legislative solutions to the problem. Some of these are some easy fixes, but there has to be the will behind it to do it. So I will be focusing on the US, but I'm hoping that some of the ideas and thoughts and questions that we'll get will allow us to look at this as an international issue with solutions that can be created for individual countries. And finally, I'm just going to make one note. Today is Giving Tuesday, and we would certainly appreciate your support to continue the important work of protecting missing and exploited children. And Hannah is going to drop in a link to our Giving Tuesday page. And if you're feeling generous, we would certainly appreciate your support. So how big a problem is the issue of kids missing from institutional care? On average, it's reported that 55 kids a day go missing, and that at least, sorry, I can't see this because people are in my way. At least 100,000 children in foster care have had their cases closed by the Child Welfare Agency before the child was found. This is obviously really, really concerning, because if we close that case, we're not looking for that child. And finally, an unknown number of foster children age out of the system and while they are still missing. So no one knows where that child is. Now, these are the numbers that are reported, but I will tell you that in my estimation, these are very, very low. They are not accurate, and I don't think they're reflective of what the scope of the problem, the real breadth of the problem is. Just sort of anecdotally, a number of years ago, I was doing a research project on cross-border child welfare in a fairly large U.S. state. And we did a 3-year project. We served about 800 children. And at the end of the 3-year project, of the 800 children that we provided services to, the agency that was responsible for them couldn't tell us where 200 of those children were. That's a huge number. That's a quarter of all the kids we served. We were not told, and they did not know where those kids ended up. Did they return to their parents? Did they return to foster care? Did they return to another relative? So if that's just a small snapshot of the scope of the problem, then the problem is much, much larger than these numbers indicate. The discussion of kids aging out of foster care is obviously something that is best left for another time, because that is a huge problem. But I really want to emphasize that when we don't look for these children are at very high risk for exploitation, harm, and other abuses and neglect. One of the impetuses for getting back into looking at this problem more closely was a recent report that was written by the United States Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. And they did an 18-month study of how many children were reported missing during the time of the research. And these numbers, 110,000 missing child episodes were reported. The average time children were missing was 34 days, but with 9 states also reporting that kids were missing for 50 plus days. That's a long time. But I think what's most disturbing is that almost 7,000 kids remained missing at the conclusion of the study. Again, that means we're not looking for those kids. Those kids are out there. They are at high risk for trafficking and other abuses. And we need to know, where they are and what's going on with them. After they concluded this report, they realized that one of the big problems was that they didn't think, based on what they found, that children were being reported regularly to the National Crime Information Center's missing person file and reporting these cases to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So they are currently undertaking an audit in all 50 states to see if these children are actually being reported missing, and if not, what are the what are the barriers to having these kids reported and having law enforcement respond appropriately to these missing episodes. So I think that's going to be a big help in terms of understanding one of the major barriers to this problem, which is we don't know the scope of it. So what does it mean to be a, quote, missing foster child? And I think this is one of the most frustrating aspects of this, and Alaura and I have certainly talked about this. There's no agreed upon definition of what it constitutes to be a missing child. Not all states define missing in the same way, and most states don't even have missing listed as a status for a foster child in their care. And so what happens is the default status for children who go missing is runaway. And as I've said before, and I will talk about this a little bit more further down on in my presentation, is when you classify a child as a runaway, then the response to that child going missing is often very slow. It doesn't have the sense of urgency that you would have when a child is abducted or a child is, taken by a non-custodial parent or something like that. So these are the kinds of things that are really frustrating for folks who are working on this issue, because it seems like, of course, if you had a category of missing, regardless of the reason the child went missing, then you would have that response that was appropriate to a child missing, whether it's a foster child or not. And again, we have to assume that any missing child, regardless of why we decide that we think they went missing, that these kids are highly vulnerable, again, to exploitation and harm, and that we need to respond accordingly because of that risk. Law enforcement often places a much lower priority on recovering missing runaway youth than other types of missing child cases. So when we categorize kids missing from foster care as runaways, we're both victim blaming. We're saying it's their fault that they're missing. They did it, by choice. But again, as I said earlier, it informs the law enforcement response to locating the missing child. Now, this is a global problem, whether the child runs away from home or the child runs away from foster or institutional care. Law enforcement does not respond appropriately to children who are categorized as being runaways. And there's also an interesting dichotomy that I've been reading quite a lot about. When a child who's a non-foster child are groomed online and are classified as being missing, they are being lured away from home. But when foster kids are groomed online and leave, they're still classified as runaway. So again, we're sort of victim blaming, and we're putting kids who are in foster care at really high risk for, obviously, if they've been groomed online, they're going to be trafficked, there's going to be sexual exploitation, there's going to be labor exploitation. And so we need to stop redefining why these kids go missing simply because they're foster kids and the assumption is that they've run away. The other thing that's interesting to note is that kids who go missing from foster care aren't always runaways. Recently got some really interesting information from the U.S. Department of State Office of Children's Issues, talking about children who have been abducted by a non-custodial parent and taken to a foreign country. And when this happens, when it happens to a non-foster child, obviously the Department of State, which is the central authority for the Hague Convention on International Parental Abduction, will get involved if the child is reported to the Office of Children's Issues. But many social service agencies don't know that they can report that child as being abducted, and that the Department of State will treat this as any other parental abduction case, and will work with the country in which the child has been, to which the child has been taken, to determine whether that child can be safely returned, either to foster care or to family leave. So it's important to understand that running away, while it's a very common reason for kids to go missing from foster care, it is not the only reason that kids go missing from foster care. I'm using this slide just to sort of show some of the discrepancies in the way in which data is collected about children who go missing. And again, because running away is a very common reason for children to go missing from foster care, we need to look at what those numbers are and why there's such discrepancies in the ways in which we are counting how many kids go missing. So in 2012, a study that was done by the National Runaway Hotline in the United States estimated that approximately 1.6 million children run away every year. Yet, on average, our National Center for Missing and Exploited Children report that there's somewhere between 450,000 and 500,000 kids that are reported missing. That's a huge discrepancy. If 1.6 million kids are running away and only 500,000 kids are reported missing, then there's a vast majority of runaway kids who are not being reported as missing. And so if we look at this in the general sense of kids running away and apply this to the issue of kids being missing from foster care, we know that they are not reporting kids who are running away as missing children. The result is that there's an estimated 700,000 homeless youth in America. And that, again, is also a staggering number when you think about it, because these kids are at very high risk for sex trafficking because they're mentally, physically, and financially vulnerable. They will do what they need to do to survive. And unfortunately, traffickers are fully aware that these kids are vulnerable and that they will do almost anything to get the basics of food and shelter and clothing and those sorts of things. We know that youth who've had contact with Child Protective Services in the past are significantly at higher risk for sex trafficking than any other group of children. 70 to 90% of all commercially sexually exploited children have been victims of sexual abuse in the past, and the vast majority of those have had contact with Child Protective Services, either as a foster child or in-home care with the family. So we've got to look at what is going on with these kids when they leave, and particularly those kids who end up on the streets. And again, this is just to remind folks that when we don't look for missing foster children, we're going to end up seeing these kids being sexually trafficked. The study in 2007, I could not find any more recent data, that children in foster care are the most commonly sexually trafficked children in America. And when they go missing and we don't look for them, this is what's going to happen. And this is why this is such a crucial issue for us to be looking at and develop some solutions to this issue. Again, this is just a another set of issues that 2/3 of all sexually trafficked children have had a history of abuse and involvement with Child Protective Services. These are kids who are known to the people who are supposed to be protecting them, and yet we don't follow through. And there's sort of the falling through the cracks is what people say, and that's just not an acceptable response to this kind of problem. The nexus of missing and exploitation is obvious when you look at these kinds of numbers. We're going to be doing a webinar in a couple of months on children with high vulnerabilities, missing children with high vulnerabilities, but foster children with intellectual disabilities, children in group homes, and children with a history of running away are also at heightened risk for sex trafficking. Whenever a trafficker can identify a vulnerability of a child, particularly with intellectual disabilities or children who have, had trauma or have other, physical disabilities, they're going to exploit those vulnerabilities any way that they can. So again, the issue of sex trafficking and missing foster children goes hand in hand, and we need to figure out ways to address how to stop this from happening and to stabilize those placements and make sure that the children have what they need so that they're not leaving either by force or by choice. There are currently requirements, both federal and state requirements, on what happens when a child goes missing from foster care. States are required by law to report missing children in foster care to law enforcement and ICMEC immediately and no later than 24 hours after the child goes missing. States are required to develop policies to locate children who go missing from foster and institutional care. And states are required to stop payments to foster families if a child is missing for more than 14 days. I had a long chat with a senior official at the ICMEC, and they acknowledged that their gut feeling is that this is not being done regularly. And again, if we go back to the issue of not being able to classify a foster child as missing, then we see where the problem begins. ICMEC doesn't have a clear number in mind of how many kids they think go missing from foster care, because you can't prove a negative. They can't, if people aren't reporting it, ICMEC can't possibly be expected to know what the full scope of that is. But they're sure that the number is higher than the numbers that they're being given. And again, the IG's office is undertaking these audits of states to see whether or not this is an accurate assumption. So what are the barriers to recovering missing foster children? Some of these are things, again, that I think are easy fixes, and certainly things that Alaura and Senator Cornyn are thinking about in terms of this legislation. But there are several. Locating children who repeatedly run away. Again, the difficulty in locating them is that no one's looking for them. So it's a bit of a catch-22. Obtaining cooperation from the family and friends of the missing foster child. Going back to family is one of the most common things that kids do when they leave. A lot of kids express sort of anxiety about the fact that they get a lot of pressure from the family to return, even though they know it's not in their best interest. But there's that really sort of that sense of obligation to the family. And so when family and friends don't cooperate, often it's because they put this kind of pressure on the kids to return home. Again, obtaining assistance from law enforcement. when you're reporting this kid as a runaway, law enforcement's going to respond the same way they do to most runaway cases, which is we'll look for them if we happen to see them, but we're not going to commit a lot of resources. And again, it becomes even more true when a child is a repeat runaway. Limitations to technology. I've talked a little bit about that. Databases don't have a category of missing. They only have a category of running away, which means we're getting really incomplete and inaccurate data about how many kids are missing. Lack of oversight to ensure timely reporting of missing foster children is a real issue as well. Caseworkers are often confused as to what they're supposed to do when they discover that a child on their caseload has gone missing. And because, there aren't necessarily sort of experts in the office who can say, okay, you have to report them to law enforcement, you have to report it to ICMEC. Often they will look for the child themselves, but we know that social workers are overworked and underpaid and don't have a lot of time or experience in locating a missing child. So there needs to be some more training. There needs to be connections to resources so that the caseworker, the frontline person who's going to be the first person to find out that this child is missing, knows what to do and does it in a timely manner. Continuing to pay maintenance fees to foster parents even after the kids go missing. This is this is sort of a crazy real problem. In one of the articles I was looking at, there in one state, over a period of 18 months, over $650,000 was paid to foster families when the foster child had gone missing. That's an astounding amount of money. And if you multiplied it by all 50 states, it's almost $32 million in 18 months that's being paid for the care of a child who is not in that foster home and nobody knows where they are. Most states report that they do not routinely identify or track cases when foster care providers did not report kids missing. So in a lot of cases, what will happen is the child will go missing. The foster parent doesn't report it because they're continuing to get foster maintenance payments. And it's not found out that the child is missing until the next court case comes up, for example, or the next time the social worker is supposed to have contact with the child. And that could be weeks or months. So again, we're paying money for the care of kids that are missing and we're not looking for them. Not having photos of missing foster kids and the inability to share information about missing foster children due to privacy laws is also a real problem that needs to be fixed immediately. In my conversations with the people at ICMEC, they are able to, with permission from the state, share a picture to make a poster of a missing child, but most states do not allow them to do that because information about foster children is considered private and it cannot be shared because law enforcement and NCMEC are not child protection agencies. So when you can't share information about the child, you can't get that poster out there and you can't have people looking for that child. So let's talk about some potential solutions. Obviously, the first one is revising these privacy laws. I certainly understand why there are privacy laws about foster children, but there has to be a way in which we can share necessary information to ensure that people are looking for these kids. We need to utilize current technology to look for missing kids. And I'll talk a little bit about ICMEC's proprietary technology that would allow people to do this, but there are plenty of other ways. When we do Amber Alerts for non-foster kids, we use technology to get that information out in front of the public so that they can be a part of the solution and finding that child. We need to require states to provide clear evidence of the steps that they are taking to locate and recover missing foster children. and I think Alaura will probably talk a little bit about this as well. They are supposed to have these policies and procedures in place, but we do not hold them accountable to provide us with the information that allows us to know whether they're actually following those guidelines. And this is my pet peeve, the last one: do not allow any case of a missing foster child to be closed, even if the child ages out of the system. When you close that case, and in some states, they close the case as quickly as 6 months after the child goes missing. If that child returns, even before they age out, they're not any longer they don't any longer have access to the services that they would have had if they had not gone missing from foster care. There was a very interesting research piece done by 2 television stations in the US about what happens when kids who've been missing from foster care return and they're told their case was closed and there's nothing that can be done for them. This is a real disservice to kids. And again, it puts them at increased risk for various types of exploitation. Oops, sorry. The other thing is to better educate foster kids and foster families about grooming and trafficking. This is obviously a universal for all kids and all families, but particularly because we know that foster kids are so vulnerable to grooming and trafficking, this needs to be a part of the training for foster families, and it needs to be reinforced with the kids as well. We need to require that there's a photo ID for the child that is updated at least every 6 months. And ICMEC also suggests that if a child goes missing, as soon as they return, is to have another photo taken of them, because often, as they were saying, when kids go missing, they'll come back and they'll have a tattoo, or they'll have a new piercing or something. So when a child is recovered from a missing situation, is to have a new photo taken so that it's as up to date as possible. Require that every child is looked for, regardless of the reason that the caseworker or the foster family or law enforcement thinks they go missing. Every child needs to be looked for. And finally, again, this is a simple fix: update databases and other technologies to better track and gather outcomes for missing foster children. We have got to make missing a status in databases for foster children. So I always like to talk a little bit about the technology that ICMEC has that would allow us to be looking for all of these kids. The GMC engine, which is our technology, can be used reactively to alert the public of missing child cases, manage case information, and search for and locate missing kids. It can be used proactively to register information about children missing from foster care. So if the child is registered in the GMC engine, when they enter foster care, when they go missing, that information is immediately accessible. This is the largest missing child alerting system in the world, and case managers have the ability to geo-target alerts to specific cities and regions. So if we think that the child's run away to be with their family, you can immediately geo-target all the alerts in that area. Or if we have an idea based on looking at the child's online activity, where they might be, we can geo-target those alerts to that area as well. In addition, the GMC engine has a mobile application, which would mean that when it was discovered that that child was missing, immediately in the field, the caseworker can put that information into the GMC engine and start the process of alerting and geo-targeting alerts to find that child. So as a transition to Alaura's presentation, we're just going to talk a little bit about the ways in which legislation, federal legislation, can be used to assist in the process of protecting missing kids from foster care and preventing kids from going missing from foster care. And the bill that is being created, and again, Alaura is going to talk more about this, but just to give you sort of a basic background, the purpose of the bill is to amend Part E of Title IV of the Social Security Act to require the Secretary of Health and Human Services to identify obstacles to identifying, responding to children missing from foster care and other vulnerable foster youth, to provide technical assistance relating to the removal of such obstacles and for other purposes. So that's the end of my presentation. Again, please put questions in the chat. As Hannah said, Alaura is a legislative assistant for Senator Cornyn. She works on civil rights and liberties, minority issues, education and families, labor and employment, and science and technology issues for the senator. And I'd just like to thank Alaura for her willingness to share her views on the important topic and for her willingness to share with us the information about this potential solution to a growing problem. So thanks. And I'll hand it over.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today to discuss this very important topic. The bill that we have introduced is called the Find and Protect Foster Youth Act. This bill came about from Senator Cornyn. He was reading some articles, and it actually was related to unaccompanied minors going missing when they come to the United States. And so he then started thinking, like, I wonder if this is a problem amongst foster care youth here in America. And sure enough, it wasn't hard for him to find several articles. And one in particular that he directed me to was through the Wall Street Journal. Of course, we read the article and began doing some research and kind of looking at solutions. We definitely wanted to try to go for some of the smaller balls first to make sure that there's an audience for this here in Congress, bring importance to the issue, and then kind of build momentum from there. So initially, when we first introduced the bill, we also we do have House co-sponsors. That's going to be Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson and Congressman Tony Gonzalez, both of Texas, because, this is an issue we deeply care about, and we definitely wanted members who cared about this issue as well as those who are on relevant committees such as ourselves. We sit on Senate Finance, so this issue is a part of the jurisdiction of Senate Finance Committee, as well as for the congressman and congresswoman in the House. So when we first put this bill together, we basically saw that there was a discrepancy in that the data was not getting back to the Administration for Children and Families in a timely manner. So what we look to do is to create a feedback loop between the states and the Administration of Children and Family capacity building centers in the Children's Bureau. And so creating this feedback loop would also allow real-time experiences to inform the technical assistance created at the Administration for Children and Families to better care for missing and runaway foster youth. But in addition to this legislation would also require that ACF report to Congress on the progress being made to find the missing foster youth and prevent runaways. A very important part of the legislative process is including your champions. So here in the Senate, we were able to get some really, really, really big champions on our side. And so that's going to be Senator Stabenow and Senator Grassley. They have been very active in this space of foster youth. So we definitely wanted to bring them on board. And with Senator Grassley's experience on Senate Finance as well, it was nice to have him on. And Senator Stabenow is on Senate Finance as well. So once we got together, kind of put the base text together, that's when we began to do some work amongst the caucus, the committee, as well as with the Administration for Children and Families. And right after we introduced this bill, a report came out, and Senator Wyden, who is the chairman of the committee, of the Senate Finance Committee, asked us to incorporate some of the recommendations from that report in with an emphasis on human trafficking. And so through our process, we have also added some additional components to the bill from what was initially introduced. That piece isn't available on congress.gov yet because we've been working internally in efforts to present this once it's finalized and has the correct input from everyone. But we added some protocols for screenings and running away, such as when the child comes back, doing additional screenings for sex trafficking and abuse to ensure that those issues are being addressed when they come back into the home, if they are found. Additionally, the Administration for Children and Families, they provided some feedback for us to think about as we are incorporating this bill into the law, if that's something that ends up happening. We're very hopeful for that. But they asked us to add some authorizing funds. So we are in the process of doing that to kind of give them a somewhat of a budget so they're able to employ the right contractor to help them with the technical assistance as well as actually implementing the report. They also asked that we not limit their ability to be able to provide technical assistance and this feedback loop. So they actually asked us to strike the area related to the capacity building centers. And at first I was a little confused, but after speaking with our congressional research expert on these issues, Miss Emily, she let me know that the administration is just really looking for flexibility. They don't only want to use the capacity building centers as their only option to carry out this bill. So we have decided to also oblige in striking that portion of the bill for them. So right now, our goal is to continue to work with the committee and get the members of the Senate Finance Committee into agreement, which most of them are. We haven't had any pushback really, but you also kind of need them to sign off in effort to get this included in, you know, whether it's a standalone bill or a larger package that will be moving within Congress. So that's kind of the status of where the bill is currently. I will share who is currently a co-sponsor of the bill, and that is, we have 8 co-sponsors in total. One second, it's taking a little second to load. But I definitely wanted to get that for you, just in case any of these members are your member of Congress. Well, I guess, oh, here it is. So we have Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. We have Senator Chuck Grassley of Indiana. We have Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee. We have Senator Robert Casey of Pennsylvania. Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Senator Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico, and Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. So as you see, it is a bipartisan bill with a lot of amazing champions that not only sit on Senate Finance, but they sit on Judiciary as well as the Health Committee, which all 3 of these committees have a lot to do with the legislation that is implemented and put forth in the foster care children and family space in general. So that's really all I have to share about the bill, and I look forward to your question.
Great, thank you so much. I will go ahead and check the chat and the Q&A for any questions. Please feel free to continue adding there. Alaura, I think the first one here is for you. So this person wanted to know what were some of the most effective arguments, statistics, or testimonials that helped you get attention for this issue in the US? Perhaps this could be used in other countries.
A lot of the information that Felicity shared were those arguments that we discussed. The biggest thing, like I said, that brought this about was the senator hearing about how many unaccompanied minors that are coming here to the United States have gone missing. And that's what led to us looking into this issue for foster care children, because like Senator Cornyn is a very active member on the Judiciary Committee, which is where the unaccompanied minors, they kind of fall in between a couple different jurisdictions, but it also just put a spotlight on that, because if we can't keep up with children that are coming here to our country, and we can't keep up with children that are here in our country, that means that work needs to be done on this issue. And so that was one of the the big emphasis on what brought this on, but also a lot of the stats that Felicity shared at the beginning on that there's actually not even a category for missing. You know, they're automatically assumed to have run away, and we know that's not the case. We know that foster youth are vulnerable, and there are a lot of things, a lot of different factors that will go into, you know, them potentially running away, but we also know that that's not every child. And a lot of it has to do with the environment around them, and we want to make sure that we're taking care of them. That's literally one of the roles of the United States, is to take care of, you know, children in foster care.
Great, thank you. And I think actually to that point, I actually had a question, maybe Felicity can answer about some of the data she talked about. You briefly mentioned how it was difficult to find recent studies. And we, also discussed a lot of the reasons why it's, difficult to find missing foster children. Like, what do you think the reason that this is such an understudied and kind of under-researched area is?
That's the $10,000 question, isn't it? It's very interesting, actually. If you look at sort of the early 2000s up to about 2015, 2012, there was a lot of research being done on this issue. HHS had all these grants to do various kinds of studies, and there was a lot of support at the federal level for research around the issue of child protection, child welfare, unaccompanied minors, a variety of things. But I don't know why it became less interesting when the numbers clearly are increasing. There's also been, and I think this is a really unfortunate sort of occurrence, is sort of a separation of missing and exploitation. And so exploitation is getting lots and lots of attention. And there's lots of studies about child sexual abuse materials. There's a lot of research being done about sexual exploitation during the pandemic, but we've separated it from kids going missing. And I think that's a real problem, because the intersection of missing and exploited, I think any of the slides that we've looked at today or that we've talked about previously, it is very clear that when kids go missing, they are highly vulnerable to exploitation. And to separate those two things, I don't know whether it's because it's a more immediate response from people, that sort of gut feeling about, child sexual exploitation. But I've said in the past, like, anybody who's been responsible for the care of a child, whether as an auntie or a parent or a babysitter, and that kid goes missing, you turn around and that kid is not there, that is the most heart-wrenching, heart-stopping moment. And we need to sort of get back to understanding that what we're allowing this to happen far too frequently, and we need to get back to really looking at the intersection of missing and exploitation.
Great, thank you. I think we have a couple more questions about kind of the bill and different things included in it. So just first off, what is the timeline to get it passed? Do you know?
Yeah, so currently, as I shared, we are in the process of getting co-sponsors. One of the biggest things for legislation to move in the Congress is, one, it needs to have unanimous consent in the Senate. So getting members' input, and honestly, we did a lot of that at the beginning. So it's really getting them to put their name on this and showing that to the committee. And we're also working with committee for a legislative path forward. Ideally, of course, we would love this to be included in an end of year legislative package, but the reality is there's 100 senators, and each senator is coming with 20 asks for the end of year package. So we're trying trying to do our due diligence to make this an easy lift for the committee to include this in some legislative package moving forward.
Great. We have another question here about, is there anything included in the bill to protect children from being trafficked while in foster care? We talked at length about how this is an issue. So is there anything specific to that point?
Yeah, so in this bill, there is not an enforcement piece. And I would like to be clear that when enforcement happens, it doesn't always have to come from legislation. The Administration for Children and Family and the Department of Human Health, Human Services, they have a lot of enforcement authority on a lot of these different issues. The point of us bringing this bill is to do two things, but one of those things is to let them know that there are members in Congress that really care about this issue and that we're going to be on you about this issue. We're going to pester the crap out of you until you implement it, because we don't want to have to be, put the clause into everything. We shouldn't have to, because they already have a job. We shell out billions of dollars to the Department of Health and Human Services a year. And so enforcement is considering that, like I said, the Senate Finance Committee, the reason why that's in our jurisdiction, because a lot of that money is created through tax revenue and things like that. So they have the financial incentive to kind of put the teeth into a lot of these things. So this bill is more of a way to work with the administration to figure out before we have to put all of these things into a bill, because honestly and truly, this is one of the first bills that even just address missing foster youth in this Congress in particular. So it's honestly just the first step. But we definitely, to answer your question, Lindsay, that we will be looking for enforcement mechanisms if we don't see any progress. And that's why we really want to get this bill done this Congress, because this bill is also asking for the Department of HHS to report to us what is their progress being made on this issue. And if we see that there's no progress being made, then yes, the next step is putting that teeth behind it and putting those enforcement. And you know what? To be honest, states don't like that. So we don't want to come out with a bill that automatically states are going to be against. We want this to be an effort that we can all work towards together. So we know that the Administration for Children and Family, they have the capacity to provide information to states, put in place opportunities for training. Some of the solutions that Felicity talked about today, they can be implemented without the law. So it's honestly creating this momentum. We definitely planned on sending some additional letters asking about these issues, which we look forward to working with everyone on. But I'll say that about enforcement.
Hannah, can I just add that to Alaura's point, a commonly noted problem for social workers and child protection agencies is they don't know that there are these resources. And Alaura is absolutely right. There are plenty of resources out there to help states and counties, if it's a county-based system, to adhere to the law, to get those policies and procedures in place, and to show that sort of accountability, but they just don't know how to get to it. And so I think it's sort of on us, whether, we're in a senator's office or in an NGO, or we're, in the know, is to get that information out there, because once people know what they're supposed to be doing, I don't think there's any malice behind this whole issue. It's just a lack of knowledge. And so legislation like this really does provide that sort of moment of this issue to be in the spotlight so that you can get the word out there about these existing resources. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that we work with the administration on these things. Like I was sharing earlier, when we got the technical assistance with them and they asked us to strike the capacity building centers. Like I said, at first I was confused, but then once I was able to learn more, they don't want that to be their only mode to address this issue. As technology continues to progress, they will have new tools at their disposal that just may get that information to states quicker. And I think it's really important, being able to give them that flexibility so they can use new innovative tools to also get that information out to states. Because I think we talked about it on the call. Caseworkers, those who work in the child welfare space, oftentimes are overworked and underpaid. So we definitely want to make sure that we're working with the administration and not putting on burdens and limiting them to specific processes when they may have a more efficient and effective way to get the message down to states and those who work in this space. And I see the next question from Dean. We answered the
Mhm.
first question, but yes, the bill will be for all states.
Great.
Because
Yeah,
it's really more of a directive to the Department of HHS, which the Department of HHS, if you get money from the Department of Health and Human Services related to, foster care, then yes, you are going to be included in this bill. And that's every state right now, including
great.
Puerto
Thank you.
Rico.
That's great. So I think we could just move on to the last one there. A little bit of a shift, but talking about this person's a police officer and they have some experience with grooming and recruiting minors to commit felonious crimes as to get lesser time in prison. So kind of talking about that and maybe applying it to children from missing from foster care as well. What the way forward is.
I'm not, I mean, I've heard of that happening, but it's certainly not something that I've come across in terms of the research that I've been doing over the last couple of months into the issue. So I can't with any sort of surety answer that question about how we would move forward from that. I mean, I think whether a child is being groomed online for, terrorist activities or drug muling or sexual exploitation, we need to address the issue of the grooming online rather than necessarily what it is they're being groomed for. And that, I mean, it's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but, it is an issue of the kinds of behaviors and identifying the vulnerabilities of the child and seeing, what they can get the child to do. But I don't know a lot about the issue of kids being groomed online for terrorist activities.
Yeah, Fatima, thank you so much for asking that question. I think you bring in a good point that we look forward to addressing as well. Felicity put that in her notes about making sure that we have the proper training for our foster care youth, because let's be clear, a lot of things are outdated. And so this is moving us, of course, further and further in the 21st century when we're addressing new crimes or unconventional crimes, and how they are targeting these young, vulnerable people. And so I definitely think this is something that we need to be looking, you know, with the Department of Justice on TA for how we can ensure that this type of training and they can know the signs, not only for the foster parents, but also for the foster youth. So they can know what these signs look like, so that moment of conscious of like, I know this is wrong, but you know what, I remember seeing that this is how they're going to try to lure me in. Doing as much education as possible is definitely going to be a way to help. It's not going to solve the issue. This bill is not a silver bullet, and it was never intended to be a silver bullet, because if we were looking to have a silver bullet, this bill would have way more components, way more pages, and a lot more input from a lot of other people. But like I said, we really just wanted to bring this bill to the forefront because it's one, an issue that we care about. Two, we wanted to bring this issue to light for other members who care about this issue. A lot of the members across the foster care and adoption caucus, they all kind of have their own niche of areas that they address. But and sometimes they're specific to their state with issues that are going on in their state. But what, the purpose of the caucus is to ensure that members are able to highlight several different issues in this, in this foster care space, in child welfare space.
Great. Thank you both for your answers to those questions. We still have a few more minutes, so if anyone else has anything else to put, they can go ahead and still add that to the Q&A. For now, though, I will share Felicity's contact information so that if anything comes up later, you can continue to ask questions. And you can also reach out to the ICMEC's information email as well. But I will give just one more minute to see if there are any other questions.
And Hannah, I'll just add that if you have questions for Alaura, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll just act as the liaison because she's a very, very busy woman. So feel free if you have questions for her as well to contact me, and I'm happy to pass those along to her.
Great. I don't see any more questions, but please reach out if you do have them. So I'll go ahead and just close this out. Thank you both so much for a really informative presentation, and Alaura for joining us on the series. I think you've brought a really great perspective to hear about kind of legislation and solutions that are in the works right now. And thank you all for joining us. We are really excited to continue to do these webinars as ICMEC has gotten started. We've done 3 so far, and we hope to continue bringing these really important and timely issues to you. If you have any questions, like we mentioned, please reach out to Dr. Northcott or ICMEC's information email. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this, it is Giving Tuesday, which is an international day of donations and charitable giving. And we at ICMEC are focusing specifically on missing children's issues. So any contribution you can give, whether that is donating at the link we discussed, or just sharing on social media, or sharing your participation in this webinar or something that you learned from this presentation, it really helps to further that mission to help power the search for missing kids. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, everyone, and the kind words in the chat.